what are the Old and New Testaments? People think that they're just sections of the Bible, and while in a way that is true, what we're going to be discussing today is what that word testament is meant to be understood as, because in the narratives that were given, both in the Old and New Testaments, they are also under an Old and New Covenant, and this would, of course, be something we need to define and understand if we're to grasp the setting in which human history was relating to God, that being, of course, the whole point of the Bible, to tell us how God's interacted with us throughout history. And noting that the arrival of Jesus Christ certainly set a turning point in how mankind related to God, we're going to start, of course, with the Old Testament and move on to the New Testament. But before we clarify testaments or covenants, let's first make sure we understand that word. The word covenant, translated as the word testament, comes from the word, berith, which is a coming together or a legal promise. So if you obey the terms, you're good. If you disobey the terms, you're in trouble. You violated that covenant, that legal agreement between two or more parties and how they're going to relate to each other. A good modern example would be the covenant of marriage, of course, established in the ancient history of the Bible. But when we're asked, okay, what is the covenant of marriage? Well, it's a legal agreement that on these terms you relate to each other. And if you violate that term, of course, infidelity, abandonment, so on and so forth, then you violated that covenant. A divorce takes place because that covenant, that agreement, has been broken. You promised to be faithful to this one person for your life, and you didn't keep that, so you violated it. Well, concerning legal agreements then in the Old and New Testaments, the Old Testament actually includes 3 covenants, and the New Testament establishes 1. The overwhelming majority of the Old Testament is involved in one major covenant, and that being the covenant of the law. But there were 2 that took place before it that actually foreshadows the one in the New Testament. We're going to discuss all 4. So starting with the Old Testament, what covenants were included in that section of Scripture? Well, the first that came up, of course, noting Adam's covenant with God as well, don't eat the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the day you eat of it you shall surely die. Well, what was the covenant? If you didn't eat the fruit, you had a relationship with God. If you ate the fruit, you didn't. But that wasn't necessarily a covenant. That was just the terms and conditions of them being created. When mankind separated themselves from God, there was this need for a legal covenant to take place because man was now fallen. We weren't expected by nature to be able to keep promises. We needed some sort of incentive. Adam and Eve didn't know what it was like to be separate from God, and so this is just what came naturally. When they rejected him and those terms, then natural suddenly became a bad thing. But then moving on from that point, the first major covenant, the legal agreement that included benefits and, of course, was a foreshadowing of Jesus Christ as well as negatives if they disobeyed them, was the covenant of Noah. We read in Genesis chapter 9 and verse 8, "Then God spoke to Noah and his sons with him, saying, And as for me, behold, I establish my covenant with you." It's the first time this appears in the Bible. "And with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the cattle, every beast of the earth with you, of all that go out of the ark, every beast of the earth. Thus I establish my covenant with you. Never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, This is the sign of the covenant which I make between me and you, every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations." So this covenant is ongoing indefinitely. "I set my rainbow in the cloud, and it shall be for the sign of the covenant between me and the earth." Note that, the 2 parties. "It shall be when I bring a cloud over the earth, and the rainbow shall be seen in the cloud, and I will remember my covenant which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. The waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. The rainbow shall be in the cloud, and I will look on it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. And God said to Noah, This is the sign of the covenant which I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth." So, to understand this covenant, we need to know 4 things. First, what are the terms of the covenant? 2, who is involved in the covenant? what does God have to do on his side of the covenant, and what does, well, the other party, I guess this would be more than just man, but what do the other individuals involved in the covenant have to stay in this agreement? This, of course, is going to be foreshadowing the new covenant, but notice these 4 questions and their answers. What are the terms of the covenant? It's all on God. God will not destroy the earth with a flood again. Who is involved in this covenant? God and everything else, everything that lives on the earth, man, cattle, birds, sea creatures, everything. I don't think they would notice much, but you notice the point there. So what does God have to do in order to keep this covenant? If God violates the covenant, then obviously he's not worthy to be called God. He's dishonest. But if he does keep the covenant, what's the one thing he's required to do? Not flood the earth. And what does everything else have to do in order to keep their side of this bargain? They just kind of have to exist. There's not a lot of requirements placed on mankind or the animals. It's saying, like, if you violate this term, then a flood's going to happen again. No, the covenant was, and the first time a covenant appears in the Bible is God says, I promise not to flood the earth again, and you can bear my witness on that, being reminded of it by the rainbow. But interestingly enough, the covenant was kind of one-sided. It was all on God to be good, not for us to not be bad. So that's important to note. But then continuing on, the second covenant, and the one where we start to narrow it down into the realm of the Jewish people, is the covenant that was made with Abraham. This was found in Genesis 15, verse 21. Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram. He wasn't renamed Abraham at this point. And behold, horror and great darkness fell upon him. Then he, God speaking, said to Abram, Know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. So note the prophecy. And also the nation whom they serve I will judge. Understatement of the century. Afterward they shall come out with great possessions. Now as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a good old age. But in the 4th generation they shall return here. So this would be in Canaan, where he was currently living. For the iniquity of the Amorites, the people living there, is not yet complete, meaning they haven't sinned enough to warrant judgment yet. And it came to pass when the sun went down, and it was dark, that behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a burning torch that passed between those pieces. I'll explain that in a moment. On the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, To your descendants I have given this land. And note the borders there. From the river of Egypt, that is the Nile, to the great river, the river Euphrates. That's in modern-day Iraq. The Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, and the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. So all of these people groups are specifically named that would be judged by God in the future by Abram's descendants. Not anyone and everyone living in the area, but specifically these people that would now be held accountable for judgment. This, of course, was seen in the book of Joshua. They were judged then, and as well in the book of Numbers as well. But what was going on here? Well, Abram was from the land of Ur, where the river Euphrates had been passing through, Iraq and Iran. And what was interesting as well is they had a way of making deals with people. If you had the resources to provide this, my ancestors, the Vikings, would cut their hands and then they'd mix the blood of each other in a handshake, and that would seal a blood pact between them. We're a little bit more sanitary today. Sometimes we spit in our hands, or sometimes we just forego the loogies and liquids and we just shake. But this is the agreement. Well, in Abram's day, he was told that God wanted to make a deal with him, a promise, a covenant. And so what they would do in that time is they would essentially make a literal red carpet out of these various animals. They would cut in half a pigeon, a lamb, a ram, a calf, basically just this row of animals that were split right down the middle. And then their blood would obviously pool in between with their bodies on the sides. They would walk through this together on the term that if they didn't keep the covenant, you can add my body to this trail. So it was a promise that you intended to keep under pain of death. So God and Abram set this up, and Abram cuts the pieces up, expecting God to come to him. But interestingly enough, what happened? Well, Abram fell asleep, and God walked between the pieces alone. Once again, a foreshadowing. But let's go through our 4 questions again. What were the terms of this covenant? Well, God is going to give Abraham's descendants, excuse me, the land of Canaan. It seems like a pretty good deal. Who is involved in this covenant? Of course, God, Abraham, Abraham's descendants, and unfortunately, the people of Canaan. If they continued in their sin, the land would be given over. God knew the decisions that they would make, but it was still conditional. Abraham would be sharing this information with them as a warning. What does God have to do? Well, simply put, give Abraham's kids the land of Canaan in order to keep this covenant. What does Abraham have to do? He just kind of has to exist. And obviously, he's going to have kids, but that's something that will happen naturally through other means. It's very interesting. The first 2 times we see the word covenant in the Bible, it's entirely based on God giving what he promised, and nothing really on our part other than just receiving it. So note that for the new covenant. But now for the majority covenant of the Old Testament, what it's going to be based on. This is, of course, the covenant made with the law. This was given to us in Exodus 24, verses 7 through 8, after reviewing over the last 4 chapters everything that would make up the law of Moses, all 619 or 13, I believe, laws. Exodus 24:7 says, "Then he, Moses, took the book of the covenant and read in the hearing of the people. And they said, 'All that the Lord has said we will do, and be obedient.'" So note that condition. "And Moses took the blood, sprinkled it on the people," so the way they would dedicate sacrifices, "and said, 'This is the blood of the covenant which the Lord has made with you according to all these words.'" What words? Exodus 20 through 24. This is where the culmination of them appears. So what were the terms of this covenant? Obey the law, Exodus 20 through 24, and you'll be blessed. Disobey the law, and you'll be cursed. Who is involved? The nation of Israel and God. What does God have to do? He has to bless Israel when they obey him, and he also has to curse Israel if they disobey him. So noting the 2 sides to this, he keeps the agreement. If I follow you, I'll be blessed. If I disobey you, I'll be cursed. Well, the you in this involved situation, God, has to fulfill both ends of that bargain. If they disobey him, they would be cursed, and he has to do the cursing. He can't relent from that because that was the agreement. And likewise, if they obey him, he has to bless them. That was the agreement. What does man have to do? Well, in this case, the nation of Israel has to obey God if they want to be blessed. Also note, to keep this covenant, they have to disobey God if they want to be cursed. So noting the conditional promises there, and this is why you see in the Old Testament, when Israel rejected God, you see things get worse, but when they obeyed God, things got better. That was the covenant. That's the context in which these exchanges between God and man were happening and their relationship with him. But you would also notice that when you read through the prophets, there was a promise made, especially by Jeremiah and Daniel, of a new covenant that was coming. And that is key, because if we read into the Old Testament, oh no, if I don't give to the church, then God's going to curse me. No, that was the Old Covenant. Oh no, if I don't do my quiet time this morning and read my Bible, then God's going to make it so that my life is miserable. A, that isn't written anywhere, and B, no, that's not the covenant that we're under. We need to recognize this. By the way, it's also worth noting that this covenant in Exodus 24, it only took Israel 8 chapters, Exodus 32, 8 chapters for them to break that covenant entirely. They disobeyed God big time, and God was within full legal rights to wipe them out. But when Moses, again foreshadowing Jesus Christ, interceded on their behalf and said, "Take my life, spare the nation," and God said, "Whoever disobeys me, they will face their judgment. But we're going to go down, and we're going to only judge the people responsible. Anyone who wants a second chance," hint, hint, "they can side with you, and they'll be spared." But this essentially sets the background for mankind's relationship with God in the Old Covenant. This is the Old Testament in a nutshell. But then we get to the New, and we wonder, okay, what was different? If Jesus was under the law and perfectly kept it, good for him, but we're still all in trouble. Well, that's the good news, is that Jesus gave a new covenant. This is the covenant that was made with the cross, the New Testament. In Luke 22:19 through 20, Jesus took bread, gave thanks and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Likewise he also took the cup after supper, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is shed for you. So what are the terms of this new covenant? Well, according to the New Testament itself, the terms are that Jesus dies for you, his blood will be offered, his body will be broken for you, and you believe it. You live forever with him, and if you reject that covenant, you won't be forced to live forever with him. Note the implications of that, but understand the point. So those are the terms. Who is involved? God and all mankind. This has been offered to the entire world. What does God have to do? Well, God has to do quite a lot. He has to die as a substitutionary sacrifice. He has to die in our place in order for the penalty of sin, everything that separates us from God, would be paid for, thus making us right with God. That's what he has to do in order to make this covenant work. A legal price has to be paid for sin, and he's willing to pay it. What does man have to do? Well, Romans 10, verse 9. Believe in Jesus and how he proved it in history. If you believe that Jesus is Lord and that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. That's the new covenant. So if we understand then the New Testament, the new covenant, is the relationship that we have with God now, we can read the Old Testament and realize, it took him 8 chapters to violate the covenant, and even then God showed him mercy. But even then, the 2 times in which the word covenant appears in the Bible, once with Noah and once with Abraham, we realize that God is kind of keen on understanding not only our limitations, but his ability to more than make up for them. That when he made a covenant, he understood, I know that you're just dust, that you by nature rebel against me. That's why I'm making promises that I will keep, and you simply have to receive them. Note, not everyone will, but if we understand that that is the terms of our new covenant, then we can fully benefit from it on his terms. Our relationship with God is as follows. Believe that he came to this world in the person of Jesus Christ, and how he proved it in a moment of history, his death and resurrection from the dead. And on that basis, you are a part of the new covenant. Note, he will do the work in your heart and life that will reflect that reality, but that is how you become a part of it. You don't have to go to a specific church. You don't have to be water baptized. You don't have to take the Eucharist. You don't have to do this and that. You have to receive it on his terms. And anything that goes beyond Scripture isn't a part of the covenant. So note that. I look forward to talking more with you. Next week we'll be going over the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. If you have any questions about the Old and New Covenants, or would like more information about these things, perhaps verses that I wasn't able to go through in the time allotted to us, please let me know in the comments. I'll look forward to talking to you all next time, and thank you for listening. God bless you.